The 19th century opened in a world where most labor was still rooted in household economies. Across rural Europe and North America, production and survival were deeply intertwined. Families farmed small plots of land, spun wool, preserved food, and raised animals. Work was continuous, seasonal, and collective, not separated into workplaces and homes. For women, labor was neither optional nor secondary. It was central to household survival. In agricultural regions, women milked livestock, managed dairies, and tended gardens. They also brewed ale, spun thread, and assisted in harvests across Europe and America. In artisan households, women helped in workshops, kept accounts, and managed small-scale trade. Widows frequently ran businesses in their own name, demonstrating their independence. Yet, this early century inherited legal systems that limited women's autonomy. In Britain and America, coverture meant a married woman's property belonged to her husband. Work performed by women was essential, but rarely recognized as independent economic identity. At the same time, demographic pressures were building, and populations were rising. Rural land was subdivided, and small plots became insufficient to sustain growing families. Markets were expanding, and textile production shifted from cottage industries. It began to consolidate into larger workshops and early factories. Industrialization didn't immediately replace household labor. It layered new forms of work. Young, unmarried women began entering wage labor in significant numbers. For the first time, large groups of women worked for wages outside the home. The meaning of work began to shift, measured in hours rather than seasonal cycles. Payment was calculated in wages rather than shared output. Time became regulated by factory bells rather than daylight. By mid-century, the separation between home and workplace became pronounced. Middle-class ideology framed the home as a private sphere of morality and domesticity. While wage labor was associated with the public world of markets and production, this division didn't reflect most women's experience, combining wage labor with domestic duties. The 19th century did not remove women from labor. It reorganized their labor. It made some forms more visible, others less acknowledged, within industrial capitalism. These transformations reshaped families, cities, legal systems, and political movements. The question was no longer whether women worked. It was how, where, under what conditions, and with what consequences. As the 19th century advanced, structural pressures intensified across industrializing societies. Population growth continued, particularly in the UK and northeastern US. Expanding urban centers required labor. Factories needed disciplined, low-cost workers. Families required income beyond what shrinking rural holdings could provide. Industrial employers quickly identified women and children as a crucial labor force. In textile mills, women were adaptable to machine-paced work and paid lower wages. Wage structures were deliberately tiered. Men with thousands of young unmarried women entered factory employment in regions like Lancashire. Boarding house systems housed female workers under supervision, blending discipline with moral oversight. Employers promoted ideals of order and temporary employment before marriage. In reality, many women remained in wage labor longer than publicly acknowledged. Simultaneously, domestic service expanded dramatically in urban households. Employing a servant became a marker of middle-class respectability. By mid-century, domestic service was the largest single occupation for women in many cities. Unlike factory work, domestic labor remained embedded within private households. Hours were long, mobility limited, and legal protections minimal. Yet, for many rural migrants, service provided wages, shelter, and entry into urban life. Not all female labor was industrial or domestic. In garment production, women worked from home as seamstresses and piece workers. They were paid by the item rather than by the hour. This system, often called outwork, allowed manufacturers to avoid factory regulation while maintaining high output. Earnings were unstable. Competition was intense. The line between home and workplace blurred again, but under more precarious conditions. Marriage patterns also influenced women's employment. In working-class families, a woman's wage often determined whether siblings could attend school or whether rent could be paid. In times of economic downturn, married women re-entered paid labor despite social stigma. Economic necessity consistently overrode cultural ideals. Legal reforms emerged slowly. Property acts passed in Britain during the mid to late century began granting married women rights over their own earnings and property. Similar reforms appeared in parts of the United States and continental Europe. These changes did not eliminate inequality, but they reflected growing recognition that women were economic actors, not merely dependents. Urbanization compounded pressures. Industrial cities were crowded, unsanitary, and volatile. Epidemics, housing shortages, and fluctuating employment created instability. Women bore much of the burden of maintaining households under these conditions. Wage labor did not replace domestic responsibility. It was layered on top of it. By the 1870s and 1880s, industrial economies had become more complex. Heavy industry expanded. Railways linked regions, and new sectors emerged. Clerical work, retail positions, and teaching began to open limited new opportunities for women, particularly those with education. These occupations were presented as respectable alternatives to factory or domestic service, but access remained restricted by class and geography. Throughout these decades, one pattern remained consistent. Women's labor was indispensable to industrial growth, yet structurally undervalued. Economic systems depended on it. Social norms constrained it. Legal frameworks slowly adjusted to it. The transformation of women's work was no longer experimental. It was becoming embedded within the industrial order. By the mid-19th century, the presence of women in wage labor was no longer a transitional phenomenon. It had become a defining feature of industrial society. Yet the nature of that labor began to shift as economies diversified and technology advanced. In textile districts, mechanization intensified. Machines became larger, faster, and more centralized. While women remained heavily represented in spinning and weaving, factory hierarchies hardened. Skilled supervisory roles were more frequently reserved for men, even when women had comparable experience. Wage differentials widened, justified by assumptions about male authority and female dependency. At the same time, education reforms gradually altered the landscape. Expanding public schooling systems in countries like France and Germany increased literacy rates among girls. This development created a new labor pathway. Teaching, elementary education, particularly for younger children, became one of the few socially sanctioned professions for unmarried middle-class women. Teaching offered modest wages and a degree of public respectability, though marriage often required resignation. Clerical work also began to emerge as a new occupational field, as railways, insurance firms, and expanding bureaucracies generated paperwork. Employers sought literate, disciplined workers. By the late 19th century, typewriters and standardized filing systems opened limited office positions to women. These roles were frequently categorized as extensions of presumed female traits: orderliness, patience, and precision, rather than a skilled administrative labor. Retail expanded alongside urban consumer culture. Department stores in cities such as London and New York employed young women as sales clerks. These environments were carefully managed spaces, blending commercial activity with moral oversight similar to earlier mill boarding houses. Work was regulated, appearance monitored, and behavior strictly controlled. Despite these new opportunities, the majority of working women remained in physically demanding and poorly paid sectors. Domestic service continued to dominate employment statistics in many urban areas. Agricultural labor persisted in rural regions, especially in southern and eastern Europe. Piecework in garment production intensified, particularly in immigrant communities in American and European cities, where entire households contributed to production. Labor activism began to reflect women's participation. Female workers organized strikes in textile mills, protested wage cuts, and formed mutual aid societies. In Britain and the United States, some early trade unions admitted women, though often reluctantly. Strikes led by women in textile towns demonstrated organizational capacity and collective leverage, even when outcomes were limited. These developments occurred alongside shifting cultural narratives. The ideal of the separate spheres, men in public industry, women in private domesticity, gained strength among middle classes. Yet this ideology was more prescriptive than descriptive. For working-class families, survival required flexibility. Women's wages were not symbolic additions. They were structural necessities. The contradiction became increasingly visible. Industrial economies depended on women's labor, while public discourse frequently denied its centrality. The result was a system in which women were simultaneously indispensable and marginalized. By the final decades of the century, this contradiction would contribute to broader political movements. Economic participation began to shape demands for legal rights, labor protections, and representation. The early shifts of the mid-century were not isolated adjustments. They were foundations for deeper structural transformation. By the late 19th century, industrial systems had moved beyond experimentation. They had become permanent structures shaping daily life. Rail networks connected industrial cities, national markets expanded, corporate enterprises replaced smaller workshops. Work was no longer organized around household rhythms. It was governed by institutions, schedules, and formal management. In textile regions of the United Kingdom and the industrial northeast of the United States, factory employment became normalized across generations. Daughters followed mothers into mills. Entire neighborhoods were economically tied to single industries. Employment records, wage books, and timekeeping systems formalized women's labor in ways that earlier domestic production never had. Industrial capitalism also standardized wage hierarchies. Women's work was increasingly categorized as unskilled or semi-skilled, even when it required precision and endurance. This classification justified lower pay scales and limited advancement. Protective legislation, introduced in some countries to limit working hours for women and children, simultaneously acknowledged exploitation and reinforced the idea that women required state protection rather than workplace equality. Domestic service evolved into a structured labor market. Employment agencies matched servants with households. Contracts became more common. Urban middle classes across Britain, France, and parts of Germany relied on female domestic workers to sustain a lifestyle that symbolized respectability. This created a layered labor system, working-class women supporting middle-class domestic stability. Meanwhile, industrial expansion generated new sectors that continued to draw women into wage labor. Migration intensified the system's reach. Rural women relocated to cities in search of wages. Immigrant women from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe entered factories in large numbers. Many also found work in domestic service. Industrial cities became sites of demographic transformation. Language, culture, and labor converged under economic pressure. Family economies adjusted. In working-class households, multiple members contributed wages. Children often worked until compulsory education laws tightened enforcement. Married women moved in and out of paid labor depending on circumstances. The industrial system depended on domestic responsibilities being fulfilled without compensation. Public discourse grew more structured. Governments collected census data, classifying occupations. Women's employment became statistically visible. Yet this didn't translate into wage equality. By the century's end, industrial society had absorbed women's labor into its foundation. Factories, offices, schools, and private homes all functioned through gendered divisions of work. These divisions were not accidental. They were embedded in law, economics, and culture. The system had taken shape, operating as a normalized order, shaping opportunities and constraints. By the final decades of the 19th century, women's participation in paid labor was measurable. Millions of women were listed under formal occupations in the UK and US. These numbers didn't capture all labor, like unpaid domestic work or informal production, but they documented a transformation already well underway. In Britain, by the 1880s, women formed a significant share of the textile workforce. Domestic service remained the single largest employer, accounting for many female wage earners. In the United States, industrial expansion accelerated female employment in manufacturing. By 1900, hundreds of thousands worked in garment, food processing, and textile mills. Piecework systems meant many additional women were economically active. Continental Europe reflected similar patterns, with female labor in textiles and light manufacturing. Agricultural labor remained dominant in southern and eastern areas, where women continued seasonal fieldwork alongside domestic duties. A large proportion of female industrial workers were young and unmarried. However, married women were not economically inactive, continuing in home-based production. Widowhood frequently pushed women back into full-time wage work. Wage comparisons illustrate structural inequality. Women's earnings were typically a fraction of male wages. Employers defended this disparity through the family wage model. But working-class families depended on multiple earners to survive. Working hours further illustrate scale. In textile mills, women commonly worked 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days a week, before protective legislation gradually reduced hours. Domestic servants frequently worked even longer, remaining on call from early morning until late evening. Urban growth magnified these patterns. Cities doubled and tripled in size over decades. Housing density increased. Industrial districts expanded. Women's labor was not peripheral to this growth. It was embedded within it. Consumer markets, food networks, clothing, production, and household services all relied on female workers. By century's end, the economic contribution of women was no longer marginal. It was systemic. National economies recorded their labor and taxed their earnings. Numbers alone, however, do not convey the lived realities behind them. Statistics reveal scale, but not exhaustion, negotiation, resilience, or constraint. Those dimensions emerge more clearly when examining daily experience. Lives structured by endurance and adaptation. The daily experience was defined less by dramatic moments and more by repetition, fatigue, and negotiation within limited choices. Factory labor imposed strict discipline. Bells signaled shifts. Supervisors monitored output. Noise from machinery was constant. Air thickened with fibers and dust. Physical strain accumulated, gradually back pain, respiratory illness, damaged hearing. Injuries were not uncommon before safety regulations improved. Domestic service carried different pressures. Servants lived within employer households, often separated from family. Privacy was minimal. Days were long. Dismissal could come without notice, leaving a worker without income or housing. Yet service could also provide stability compared to irregular factory layoffs. Home-based piecework blurred boundaries. Women sewing garments or assembling goods worked late into the night after completing cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Payment by the piece meant speed determined survival. Illness, pregnancy, or equipment failure directly reduced income. Marriage did not necessarily ease these burdens. Married women combined unpaid domestic labor with income-generating activities. Laundry services, taking in lodges, selling food, or seasonal agricultural work supplemented family budgets. Economic downturns intensified strain. Health outcomes reflected these pressures. Urban overcrowding increased exposure to disease. Limited access to medical care compounded risks during childbirth. Life expectancy gradually improved, but industrial districts often lagged behind rural areas in early decades. At the same time, work offered forms of agency. Wage earning provided some women with limited financial autonomy, particularly before marriage. Factory communities fostered friendships and mutual aid networks. Women participated in strikes and petitions demanding shorter hours or improved conditions, though leadership positions in unions were often male-dominated. Female workers demonstrated collective organization. Education reforms slowly expanded literacy, allowing more women to engage with newspapers, political pamphlets, and reform literature. Some entered teaching or clerical roles, where working environments were less physically punishing, though still constrained. The emotional dimension was complex. Pride in contributing to household survival coexisted with exhaustion. Community bonds existed alongside exploitation. Public narratives often framed women as dependents, yet daily life contradicted that portrayal. Experiences varied by region, class, marital status, and ethnicity. Economic transformation placed sustained physical and psychological demands on women. The consequences accumulated quietly. Over decades, they would influence reform movements and reshape legal frameworks. As industrial systems matured, responses began to take organized form. Pressures of long hours, low wages, and unsafe conditions did not disappear. Instead, they generated gradual adaptation, both at the individual and institutional level. Women workers increasingly participate in collective action. Strikes led by female operatives protested wage reductions and excessive hours. These actions signaled that women were not passive components of the industrial order. They were negotiating within it. Trade unions expanded unevenly. Protective labor legislation became a focal point of reform. Laws restricting working hours for women and children were introduced, sparking debate about health, morality, and gender inequality. Simultaneously, middle-class reform movements gained visibility. Campaigns for property rights, education, and employment opportunities Property acts gradually granted married women control over their earnings and assets, appearing in various states and parts of Europe. Education continued to serve as a pathway of adaptation. Training colleges for teachers expanded. Nursing emerged as a formalized profession. Clerical work increased, diversifying employment beyond factories and domestic service. Family strategies also evolved. Working-class households relied on cooperative survival methods like shared childcare and rotating employment. Extended kin networks in urban immigrant communities provided housing and job connections. Resilience became structured. Public debate intensified toward the century's end. Questions of suffrage, representation, and civic participation intersected with labor. Economic contributions strengthened arguments that women were stakeholders in national life. Employment was a sustained reality. By 1900, adaptation had reshaped expectations. Industrial societies adjusted to the permanence of women in wage labor. Legal systems, educational institutions, and labor organizations were slowly responding to a reality they could no longer ignore. These responses did not dismantle the system. They modified it, sometimes cautiously, sometimes inconsistently. The structural foundations remained intact, but the space within them had shifted. By the close of the 19th century, the transformation of women's work had altered more than labor markets. It had reshaped the structure of industrial society itself. The integration of women into wage labor contributed directly to urban growth and industrial profitability. Textile exports, garment production, food processing, retail expansion, and domestic service all depended on sustained female employment. Industrial capitalism matured with women's labor embedded in its foundation. Demographic patterns shifted. Marriage ages adjusted as wage-earning opportunities allowed young women to delay matrimony. Fertility rates declined, influenced by urban living costs and changing family strategies. Household economies depended on calculated budgeting. Education reforms left lasting marks. Expanded schooling for girls created a generation more literate and numerate. This shift influenced early 20th century labor markets, where clerical and administrative work would expand significantly. The groundwork had been laid. Legal reform accumulated slowly but steadily. Property rights legislation, factory acts, and limited workplace protections acknowledged women as economic actors within national frameworks. These changes were incomplete and often paternalistic, yet they signaled institutional recognition that women were integral to modern economies. Perhaps most significantly, the ideological divide between separate spheres and economic reality became increasingly difficult to maintain. Middle-class domestic ideals persisted, but working-class life consistently contradicted them. As political movements expanded in the early 20th century, demands for suffrage and civic representation drew legitimacy from decades of economic participation. The 19th century did not resolve gender inequality in labor. Wage gaps endured. Occupational segregation remained pronounced. Leadership positions in industry and unions were still overwhelmingly male. Yet the century established permanence. Women's participation in the formal economy was no longer episodic or confined to crises. Industrial society had been constructed with gendered divisions at its core. Those divisions would continue to evolve. In the decades that followed, particularly during global conflicts and economic upheavals, but the foundational shift occurred during the 1800s. The transformation was gradual, cumulative, and structural. It unfolded across factories, farms, offices, and private households. It changed the organization of time, the meaning of wages, and the legal standing of millions. The effects would extend well into the 20th century, shaping debates that remain active in modern labor systems. By the end of the 19th century, the story of women and work had become a story of adaptation, endurance, and quiet transformation. Millions of lives were measured in the rhythm of factory bells, the steady stitch of needlework, and the daily demands of households and communities. Work was both a necessity and a space of agency, a source of strain and of incremental power. Society had normalized the presence of women in the workforce, even as social ideals continued to emphasize domesticity. Economic systems relied on their labor. Urban populations depended on their skills, and industries thrived on their endurance. The contradictions of this interdependence versus independence, exploitation versus contribution, visibility versus marginalization would shape debates well into the 20th century. The changes were gradual, often imperceptible to those living through them, yet cumulative. Industrialization, urbanization, education, and legal reform combined to embed women as central participants in economic life. By the century's close, women were no longer peripheral actors. They were structural components of modern society, shaping both its functioning and its future possibilities. The 19th century ended not with a dramatic revolution, but with a quiet, persistent transformation. It left a legacy of resilience, adaptation, and incremental progress. The foundation laid during these decades would ripple into the following century, influencing labor movements, suffrage campaigns, educational access, and the very understanding of work itself.